I'll get things started. Firstly, very warm welcome to everyone. It's great to see you all here. It's our final environment session of the year, which is amazing. We've had 11 sessions this year, including this one, which has been fantastic. It's also the end of the sixth year that our environment group has been running, which is quite amazing too, actually. I can't believe that. And interestingly, quite a few of our group, I can see quite a few on here today, have been with us since very much those early days, which is fabulous. And then there's others, quite a few others that have joined us along the way, which is also fantastic. So, a really huge thank you to all of you for getting behind this group and really, it's all about learning and then taking that knowledge and really influencing in our networks positively for environment and nature. So, well done to all of you. And it's a huge thank you. Come a long way. Obviously, looking forward, there's so much more to keep achieving and to just keep doing our best, which is really, I think, the way we look at it. Just keep doing our best for nature and the environment and the grassroots nature of organizations like ours and all of your involvement is where change is really driven from. So thank you to all of you. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture, and also we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, we're very lucky tonight to have two really great speakers joining us. Firstly, Zali Steggall, OAM, and then after Zali, we'll hear from Jackie Mumford, which is going to be great. And Jackie is the CEO for the Nature Conservation Council of New South Wales. So firstly, we'll jump straight in just to introduce Zali Steggall, OAM. Zali is the independent member for Warringah and has been the member for Warringah since the 2019 federal election when I always like saying this to Zali, when she defeated the incumbent former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. She's also I didn't know this actually, Zali, you're the Deputy Chair of the Standing Committee on Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. And Zali's very kindly spoken to our group on a number of occasions over the years, and we're always very, very grateful, Zali. So thank you so much for joining us again this year. It's very much appreciated. Now, Zali's going to cover some aspects of what's been achieved in Parliament during 2025, particularly related to environment and nature. And then we'll just look ahead at maybe some of the goals for 2026, and then we'll have some questions. So if you've got any questions as we go for Zali, pop them in the chat and we'll come to those. But thanks so much, Zali, and over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, hi, everybody. It's always fantastic to spend some time, even if it's virtually, with like-minded people that care about our environment. I'll also start by paying my respects to traditional elders of the land on which I'm coming from and also where all of you are, and acknowledging their custodianship of land and also care of country and how much better they did at having a much lesser impact on our beautiful continent. So what Stephen said, a few areas to speak on or maybe just to take questions, but obviously since the last election, it's crazy to think, we're actually probably 2.5 years away from the next federal election. If you look forward, we're 6 months into this term, and the question is, where are we at with the second term of the Albanese government? They have a super majority, which I would argue is a mandate to actually act on climate and environment. The question is, are they so far? I would say it's probably a C- report card from me, because whilst in some ways, obviously they are progressing around the transition to renewable energy. They are, Chris Bowen is doing a fairly good job as the climate change minister in terms of that energy transition. A lot of the good work gets undone by other decisions within the government. So as soon as the Environment Minister, first decision post-election was to approve Woodside's Northwest Gas Shelf, you just undo the good work that you're doing in the other portfolio. So it's hard to sort of give them more than a C- mark because of that inconsistency of commitment. Obviously, what we've seen in this first 6 months of this 48th Parliament has been, around the Paris Agreement and climate goals, looking at how did COP30 go and what was achieved, the new NDC for 2035 for Australia, again, it's that just sitting on the fence, 62 to 70%. It's like trying to, just lacks conviction in terms of what signal it sends, in terms of also how much heavy lifting can each sector do. Anyone who loves detail and has delved into the reports, you'll see that there's very little still expected from agriculture, built environment, transport. There's a high reliance on offsets in a lot of areas and changed land use, avoided emissions. So I think there's still a long way to go. The 70% of that range was the better end of the range, but I think we can actually be going further and faster. We can't ignore the impact of our exports when it comes to global warming, and at least we've pushed the government to having a focus on national risk assessment. They've done their one-off assessment, and ironically, it was a very dire report that came out the very week followed within the week by the NDC. But you maybe won't be shocked, but not surprised to hear that the Climate Authority and the NDC was not developed in partnership or with the National Climate Risk Assessment in mind. So the two were kept quite separate. One does not inform the other, which sounds counterintuitive, but that is probably typical of this, the approach from this government. So then obviously next we've got to the EPBC Act reform. It's been some 5 years since the Samuel review, long overdue. We have, I think it's like 19 species that are in high risk. We know we have an extinction crisis. We have a problem of huge delay in terms of either applicants and projects being clearly rejected or being held up for long periods of time. So on one hand, you have business and development lobbying government for more certainty and clarity and getting approvals. On the other hand, we have environmental protection laws that don't protect the environment. So the question was, how does the government progress the implementing better standards? We saw the release of the EPBC Act Amendment Bill, where for the lower house, we had less than a week to process 1,500 pages, and then were forced to debate and vote on that legislation. As a barrister, look, I'm good at reading legislation, but even less than a week for 1,500 pages was pretty hard to digest, and I could not really, hand on heart, say that you had a genuine opportunity to properly review the legislation and be sure that it generally does what it was trying to do, or where its faults would be, or unintended consequences. So I didn't support the legislation on that basis because it just wasn't a reasonable period. It had a lot of gaps, which we tried to improve, and made a number of amendments, which I'll get to in a minute. But where the law landed, look, at least the government chose to negotiate with the Greens rather than the coalition and water down what was already poor protections, not water it down even further. But look, I still feel that what was passed is still far from what's going to be needed to reverse extinction crisis and actually properly protect the environment and biodiversity. I think, look, I certainly hope it will make a substantive difference to protect the Australian environment. It has closed a few loopholes, which I welcome. In particular around high-risk land clearing, and around native forest logging no longer being excluded, or environmentalists within 18 months. So they're good outcomes. The concerns around the legislation, though, was that it had a lot of ministerial discretion and a lot of loopholes. What we know that the new laws are empowering the minister to determine national environmental standards at a later point. So that's concerning because obviously you don't know what the standards are before considering the legislation. So that's going to be an area where I think all groups, environmental groups, need to maintain that pressure on having as strong a national environmental standards as possible, especially where powers are divested down to states. And there are a number of states that I don't think have a good track record. If I think of WA, for example, they don't have a good track record. I think, look, tried to move amendments that were important. Sorry, I should say some of the loopholes that were negotiated and with the Greens, whether they closed, was ensuring, for example, that the water trigger remained intact. That's important. Making sure that under the national interest exemption, so the laws have an exemption for a project that's deemed to be in the national interest or for national security. It was not specific as to what would classify or be considered for that. At least that was made clarified that did not include a coal and gas project, was not classified in the national interest. That's good. That's sort of the bare minimum, you would think. Certainly there's sort of better certainty in some areas for streamlining some project approvals. Ultimately, though, I think this law will fail because it doesn't acknowledge the biggest threat to nature, which is climate impacts. I just don't agree with the government that you can have environmental protection laws that ignore the biggest risk and threat. Their argument is safeguard mechanism deals with that. I disagree. Safeguard mechanism is simply an economic lever on our biggest polluters to ensure they are gradually reducing their gross emissions, but there's a heavy reliance on offsets. It doesn't address environmental impacts on nature through the climate impact. To that end, I moved 4 amendments to try and improve the law. I think first and foremost that the minister should have had a duty of reasonable care to not cause harm to future generations. I think that's the least we can do if we're going to protect the environment and biodiversity. I argued that climate-related financial disclosures should be included. Now, the Albanese government legislated for that for listed companies anyway. So to require proponents to disclose their climate-related financial risk, essentially, which essentially says that if a project had a risk of becoming a stranded asset, that should weigh against it gaining approval under the EPBC, and that would be a relevant consideration. And that sort of expanded on what's in there at the moment, which is that the greenhouse gas emissions reporting requirements across scope 1 and 2, but they are specifically excluded from the minister's consideration. So it's a bit of a tokenistic gesture in the act rather than being of any effect. And then also an amendment asking for the CEO of the new environmental regulator to reject projects based on cumulative impacts or unacceptable impacts of a matter of national environmental significance. So too often we see projects broken up into smaller pieces. They get approval and their cumulative impact is never properly assessed. That's what you get around a lot of gas extraction. And that's really problematic ultimately. So that's probably my overview of where we're at. So lots to do, but do you want me to? I don't know how we're going for time. So Stephen, you just jump in and tell me to stop when you want me to.
No, keep going, Zali. It's great. Yeah.
2025 has been interesting. Look, again, every parliament is different with the lay of the land. There is no opposition. The coalition is just so focused on itself and is returning to the climate laws. So they have not learnt anything from the last 3 elections, I would argue, and are continuing down a model of self-destruction. Obviously, today we saw the announcement of Barnaby and One Nation, which will be more attacks on climate policy and environmental protection. I think it is an interesting model where you have a side of government with a supermajority. It creates a level of arrogance and complacency on issues, and we're seeing that around, a lot more attacks on transparency around the FOI, and very little, the accountability and integrity piece is pretty disappointing. And then obviously the passing of legislation in the Senate and who the government chooses to deal with. Proud moments. Well, look, we've successfully on a macro and a micro level, nationally, we've successfully pushed the government to implement streaming content quotas for Australian stories, which is really important for us to continue having Australian content creation in Australia. On a micro level, we saved the Milsons Point Post Office. That's always very good for the community. And look, I think, continually to put the pressure on both sides of Parliament, but in particular now, I think the progressive members of Labor, the backbench, who sell a big game when it comes to being members of Lean and talk about being there to argue for good environmental and climate outcomes, but we need to make sure we hold them to account. Big project for 2026. There's a couple of issues locally. Building defects, and developers are overwhelmingly supported by government, state and federal, and building defects is a growing problem for many within the community. Truth in political advertising laws, and I actually had a meeting with Minister Farrell that was productive and positive. So let's hope in the new year I can come back with some news on that front, because we know that misinformation, especially around climate and environment, is growing and is really, there will be an attack on that over the next 2 years. I think that you can see that with Advance Australia and One Nation. And then an area I am focusing on is rights of the child. I'm really concerned at the erosion of rights of the children in relation to a lot of areas, especially Australia is a signatory of the UN Convention of the Child, but we haven't ratified it with a Rights of the Child Act. And I am concerned that in some jurisdictions we hold children criminally responsible at the age of 10. We have a number of states doing very populist policies of adult crime, adult time, holding 14-year-olds responsible to an adult level of criminality, whilst at the same time saying that a 16-year-old can't access social media. I think there's a real discrepancy in what level of responsibility we attribute to young people, and I think that should be more uniform through a Rights of the Child Act to give effect to our ratifying of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. And then really fighting on the risk assessment and adaptation piece. We have to mitigate climate, but we have to start talking about proper adaptation. Unfortunately, the fires we're seeing up on the mid-north coast already showing that properties that have been built to a higher standard of resilience are more likely to survive disasters than those that aren't. And as we talk about housing crisis and a lot of housing needing to be built, I really disagree with the government in terms of building fast and cheap. Like, they are looking at slashing approval time so that supply can be increased rapidly. I'm really concerned at the quality of what we build and where we build, that we have to make sure we're building resilient and adapted homes to the risk the risk profile where they are. We know insurance is a massive problem from a cost of living point of view, affordability and availability. And a huge amount of people aren't insured for the risk that they are in where their property sits. So lots to work on in the new year, but I'll throw it over to you, Stephen, to see if there's any questions.
Great. Thanks, Ali. Yeah, we've got lots of questions. That's great. So I might just start with one. I mean, you touched on, what's happening with the Liberals and the coalition. So in terms of then opportunity in the middle to the centre right, and further independence and the Senate and things, is there anything you want to sort of talk about there that, because obviously is there an opportunity there, do you think?
Lots of speculation. There has been speculation for 6 years, essentially. Look, obviously, the crossbench didn't really grow at the last election. It held steady. The state of the rules of play will change at the next election. In 1st of July 2026, the new donation reform laws come into play. They heavily advantage major parties with national spending caps compared to localised per electorate, and donation limits that are very different. So there's a clear difference of rules of engagement that have to be addressed. But what was really pleasing at the last election is you saw a continued growth of voters looking for alternatives, still over a third looking to vote non-major party. And so I think the more we have that mobilisation of communities and choice, I think the key, though, is maintaining integrity and making sure communities continue to have that very individualized representation. I think, the thing is, there's no point on evolving into something that just looks like the old parties, because then you're just repeating their mistakes. So as I know everyone wants to see what's happening, but I think the crossbench ultimately is the real opposition at the moment in terms of holding the government to account on policies and what needs to happen.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks, Sally. There's a few questions in the chat, so we'll try and get through as many of these as we can. Josie's asked, on balance, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about 2026?
Always optimistic. I'm always, I'm asking the wrong person. I'm a glass half full kind of person. It's always half full, because you can't curl up and quit. You've always just got to, if something hasn't worked out, you just have to tackle it another way. And I'm not afraid of a big challenge, right? So that's the thing. These are issues that are existential issues, and they are, absolutely go to the core of our country. And if you think of our environment, our very unique fauna and flora, and that responsibility to protect it for future generations, we cannot ever, it's not something you can ever quit. You have to keep chipping away at it. So I think for 2026, positive. I think there's no doubt the political landscape is changing, right? There is polarization around the world. You've obviously, look, every month that we go past that it's that one less of a Trump US presidency is great, counting down the days. But at the same time, look, there is a real shift happening in Australia, and we have to make sure as communities, as people engaged on issues, that you don't let misinformation and right-wing populist policies fill the void, or offer a populist kind of blame around the challenges that people face without the real policies. So we've got to make sure you don't leave a void, and take care of that the centrist approach in Australia.
Yeah, great. And then John's asked, do you think the recent climate-related natural disasters, the bushfires and things that you talked about, do these sort of things have any impact on Labor to be more proactive about reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Or
look, I think I would argue there's a new guard and an old guard in Labor. The old guard is the Prime Minister and, many of his front bench who are very, I would say, risk averse. They've probably all got a bit of post-traumatic stress from the Gillard-Rudd years. And so they are quick to, put up all the excuses and reasons why more can't be done. They sit on the fence on a lot of things. And I think they're really conflicted with vested interests. So, the resource minister is still very much minister for gas. You've got the environment minister pretty chummy with big gas, and the prime minister has done, I've lost count of how many visits to WA that he's done at this point, but many. I look at reforms that we desperately need around things like gambling advertising, and it's clear that the Hotel Association and the lobby groups there have way more sway with that old guard of politician versus the new guard, all the new MPs. For any of you that sit in seats with new Labor, fresh-faced, bushy-tailed MPs that are keen to make a difference, please write to them. It's really important that they feel the pressure of expectation, because they have been elected on a promise of climate and integrity and doing better. But they are very, what I've observed would be most are very, and most in the media believe that they're very subservient. They're very, they feel that they owe their position to the Prime Minister, and so what he says and wants goes. So when the media is reporting that the Cabinet, that the party room discussions, that no one raised a question, that no one raised a debate, and that there's no issue with this, that's pretty concerning. So I think, we need that at the end of the day, that needs accountability, and people need to, communities need to pressure their MPs.
Yeah, we've got a couple here around the economy as well, and just the positive impact on Australia with solar and wind, and it's been something that we've had quite a few of our speakers this year talk about, just the economic opportunities. And do you think that resonates in Parliament as well? Do you think they understand that?
Well, absolutely. Cost of living is huge. I mean, obviously we have inflationary problems. The Reserve Bank did not, lower inflation levels were too high. We need to look at that sort of balance between spending and costs. Obviously, energy prices are still a massive issue for many, many businesses and industries, especially small businesses. But look, there's a lot of misinformation around that as well. Energy prices, the Griffith University study that identifies that they could be up to 2 times higher if it wasn't for the renewable energy that's been approved into the grid. And so that is the argument that the faster we get more renewable energy in the grid, the better the prospects of bringing energy prices down. I think there's a number of issues, though. Again, insurance is one of the most inflationary component of household budgets and small businesses. So there's many areas where we need to focus on helping. The economy growth is pretty sluggish, and I think we need to keep looking at transitioning away from that reliance on the fossil fuel exports, because ultimately that is a drug we're going to have to wean ourselves off, and we have to replace it with something else. And we still need to look at what are the areas of uplift for domestic manufacturing, and what are the opportunities. And one of the conversations I've had has been with Monique Ryan, where, for example, there's a huge opportunity around medical research and science, because Trump having cut most of the funding in the US, and yet we're in a situation where the Albanese government is refusing to release even the amount of medical funding, the bare minimum under the fund that is agreed to. And we've actually got rounds of a lot of research not getting the grants that they really should be getting. So there's a lot of inconsistencies with this government, is the best way I could put it. It's not always absolutely blatantly visibly bad, but there's a lot of inconsistencies around decisions made.
Yeah.
Sally, we'll ask you one more question, then we'll let you go. But there are a few comments you might want to have a read before you.
Okay.
Giving you some tips. But just one more question for you. The Fairfax media ran a story on the weekend highlighting rising misogyny towards women MPs. Has the business of Parliament improved?
One of the first things I did this Parliament was move an amendment to the standing orders around what conduct would constitute conduct to be expelled from the chamber for. And I proposed an amendment that we should include conduct that is harassing, bullying, or intimidating. You would think that was logical. It is conduct that is illegal in every other workplace or in any other setting, but most of our laws actually don't apply into the chamber, which is the irony of parliamentary privilege, the way that's been interpreted to apply. But that amendment has now gone to a committee, and that's being looked at. And I am hopeful that that will be incorporated into the standing orders. Now, why? A number of times you will often, it's not captured on TV, but you will see members of Parliament behaving in a really mob-like mentality where they all turn on someone. I certainly experienced that last term under Dutton's leadership. And it's very hard to then apply the rules on the standing orders when it's if it's a whole party yelling at you. It's not the same as being able to pull one MP up and names them and identify them for the benefit of the speaker. So I'm hoping that we are going to change some of those rules of engagement. Has the behaviour changed? Look, it's improved, but it's got a long way to go. There's no doubt about it. And we know leadership models what's then seen as being acceptable by others in the community. And I think, look, Susan Lee, I think, is a certainly better opposition leader than Peter Dutton when it comes in terms of that behaviour. But, Yeah, there's still a lot, and when I look at social media, for example, we really need a duty of care so that there's a responsibility on platforms for how they're used and what happens there. Individually as MPs, yeah, we get a lot of hate and a lot of love.
Yeah.
That's okay. I generally only pay attention to the love. Um,
Good on you.
Good.
so
Good. Yeah.
yeah, you do get a bit of stuff where people use the anonymity of online to behave in a way and say things that is just not acceptable, and there'll often be consequences for that too.
Yeah. Fantastic, Zali. Well,
Just having a look at all these comments.
yes, lots of comments, lots of attendees, always very popular. So thank you so much for
So
joining
what's
us.
the Swiss Re report? Reinsurers list Australia's second last. The last is South Africa, as in as a market that they want to reinsure. Yeah. Look, I hosted a round table with the Insurance Council of Australia, the Australian Local Government Association, a lot of community groups, the Electrical Trade Union, a lot of sectors, because if we don't start thinking about adaptation and resilience, a huge amount of industries won't be able to work, for many hours of the days because of conditions. It's unsafe, and unfortunately, it falls back on ordinary residents pay for it because local governments have to put up their rates to pay for the emergency bill that they generally have from increasing disasters. And the adaptation piece that many local governments need to do to minimise impacts, they can't afford to do. So there's a huge piece of work there. And anyone interested, please contact my office. We've been calling on the government to invest 0.25% of GDP to offset the 2% of GDP that disasters cost the economy each year, some 40 billion. So really important that we start thinking about that prevention piece and minimising the cost down the road.
Well, thank you, Zali. That's fabulous. Thanks as always for joining us, and some lovely comments coming in here at the end, which I'm going to
Yes.
mention. Thank you for everything you do. We need more MPs like you. You're so inspiring, grateful for your determination and optimism, very uplifting. So says it all. So thanks so much, Zali, and for everything you do. And I hope you get a bit of a break, and all the best for next year.
Thank you, and happy holidays, everybody. Merry Christmas. No, I hope everyone is a glass half full kind of person and comes back full of energy and conviction for 2026. We'll make it bigger and better and keep them all, hold them all to account.
Yeah,
Thank you.
exactly. Well
Thank
said.
you, Zali.
Thanks a lot.
Wonderful. So now it's our pleasure to introduce Jackie Mumford. So Jackie's the CEO of the Nature Conservation Council in New South Wales. There's a conservation council in all or most states across the country, and I'm actually the chair of that organisation, and Luke, our treasurer, is on the call as well, and I think Pete Coughlin, another one of our directors. So you've got a few directors here, Jackie, but thank you so much for joining us. We invited Jackie. Jackie's been the CEO for about 3 years. She's an environmental scientist by background, and got amazing experience as hands-on as a campaign and advocacy expert. But as the leader of the organisation at NCC, we just really wanted to hear some hopeful and positive stories, because there have been some great wins for nature this year, particularly around the Great Koala National Park, but there's been other wins as well. So Jackie, thank you. I know how busy you are, so thank you so much for joining us tonight. And yes, over to you to tell us about some of the amazing things that have happened in the last 12 months.
Thank you. Thanks, Carolyn, and thanks, Stephen, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, hi, Luke and Pete and Annie, and I see Brenton and Brendan. So lovely to see some familiar faces and some friends of NCC on the call. That's really wonderful, and so good to hear from Zali. What an amazing advocate to have her in the federal parliament. I think last time I saw Zali speak was just before the federal election, and we were out somewhere in Western Sydney for the Sydney Alliance Assembly. So, an incredible politician who's not just there to represent her electorate, but really to advocate for these progressive issues right across the country. So, really good to see. And I can confess to being a glass half full person myself. So, yeah, a pleasure to be able to speak this evening about some of the wins that we've had this year. And I will just share my screen. Let me know if this is working okay, Carolyn, but I've got a few slides that I'd like to share.
Thanks, Jackie. That's great.
Cool. So I'm on the land of the Awabakal people, where I live in Newcastle, and I just wanted to pay my respects to the Awabakal people and acknowledge the ongoing custodianship and care for country that First Nations people around New South Wales and the country show. So Nature Conservation Council is a state-based group. So again, I think probably quite complementary. Hopefully, I won't rehash too much of what Zali's already covered, because we are really focused at reform at a state level, and we work across a number of issues that we see as the key threatening processes to nature in the state, and that's obviously climate and energy as a really important one, but nature and biodiversity in rivers and wetlands as well. So we've had a pretty big year, and it was just interesting to hear some of the politics there that Zali outlined of the supermajority that the Labor government have at a federal level and the arrogance that she articulated is born of that. And I think in New South Wales, it's interesting we have a slightly different situation because we have a government that is one seat short of a majority. So they won the election back in March 2023, but they were 2 seats short. And so we have some progressive independents on the crossbench here in New South Wales. And then just at the Kiama by-election in September, Labor won that seat back from the Liberal Party, which brings them up to 1 seat short of a majority. So, there is a little bit more negotiation, if you like, that happens in the state parliament. So I think that works really well in our favour, particularly because some of those independents or the crossbenchers are more progressive, and those include people like Jackie Scrooby, who is the member for Pittwater and used to work in Zali's office and has very similar values, and Michael Reagan on the Northern Beaches there as well. So lots of overlap with that kind of teal territory, if you like, for some of our state MPs. So it's been a big year for us. Carolyn mentioned the Great Koala National Park. I think that is far and away the biggest win that we've had for nature here in New South Wales. 176,000 hectares of land, of not just any land, but really high conservation value, tall trees of the East Coast that were being logged are going to be converted to national park. And I think that's significant for a number of reasons. First and foremost, the future viability of koala populations in the wild, but certainly the protection of those forests for a number of other biodiversity values and climate reasons. Not chopping down trees is a really important way that we stop emitting carbon into the atmosphere. But politically, it's a really strong sign of the opportunity that we have here in New South Wales at the moment. The government didn't just convert any land to national park, they converted land that was actively being logged by Forestry Corporation. So in doing that, they had to take on the industry and really have a plan for phasing out of the native forest industry on the North Coast, which I think is a really big deal. And it was something that they committed to in the lead up to the election, but they delivered on it, and they delivered on it in a big way because there was a process around that it may not have turned out that way. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a second. Another big win this year was the Independent Planning Commission rejecting Verdant Earth's application for the Redbank Power Station. And Redbank is an old coal tailings power station in the Hunter Valley that's been sort of mothballed for a while. And this project has kept, it's a bit of a zombie project that's kept coming back to burn biomass, which is effectively, burning native vegetation for energy. And we thought that was a really bad idea for a number of reasons, not least of all, again, the climate impacts. But they wanted to clear something like 700,000 tonnes of native vegetation annually to be able to keep it going. So we coordinated submissions into that process and commissioned some expert witnesses, and the IPC made the sensible decision to reject that project. Another really big win this year is the Centennial Coal Mine, which is out west of Lithgow and feeds coal directly into the Mount Piper Power Station. It's an underground mine which produces vast quantities of wastewater, which the operator of that mine is unable to deal with, frankly. And so they've had various management systems in place for that wastewater over the years. But when Mount Piper went offline for a while earlier this year for maintenance reasons, they were unable to pump the wastewater there which is one of the ways they process it is it being used at the power station. And so we sort of rallied together, and I'm sure some people on this call put in submissions and put a lot of pressure on the government to stop them from just simply diverting that wastewater into the Cox's River catchment and straight into the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area. So there was a win there in terms of the amount of water that is being pumped into that system. It's not a complete win in the sense that this is one of those wicked projects where the government keeps using the energy reliability argument for why they have to keep Mount Piper operating because of the infrastructure surrounding Mount Piper. It's really hard to get coal there. This mine has a direct line, so they understand that it's unsustainable and it's not being managed properly by the proponent in terms of this water pollution. But they can't see a clear sort of way forward for managing that. So it's something that we're working with in an ongoing way. The Murray-Darling Basin is one area of work that we're also quite focused on, both in terms of connectivity here in New South Wales in the northern part of the basin, but with a national lens, and we work with partner organisations across the basin states on Murray-Darling Basin reform. And earlier this year, NCC was actually scheduled to go out on a paddling trip to the marshes, but environmental water flows had been held up because the New South Wales government had received legal advice that unmetered water could not be released into the system, even though it's natural environmental water that should just be flowing downstream. So it was held up in weirs upstream. But we sort of uncovered what had gone on and lobbied and put pressure on the department and on the minister to have that water released in time for spring, so that all of the beautiful waterbirds and fish and water-dependent ecosystems have the water that they need in the system coming into spring. We've continued our work over the year, meeting with MPs all across New South Wales Parliament. So, Liberal, Labor, Nationals, Greens, Independents, you name it. We've been meeting with them to keep environment and climate on their agenda. I'll just mention our Tabia campaign. So that photo in the bottom, in the middle there is our campaigner, Bud Moses, who is employed by NCC but sits at the Arab Council of Australia in a partnership between our two organisations on a campaign called Tabia, which is the Arabic word for nature. And Bud's role is organising people across Western Sydney around the issue of climate and really raising the profile of climate as an issue in Arabic-speaking communities, which is really excellent. And then I did just want to touch on EPBC reform briefly. I'll try not to cover any of the ground that Zali's already covered. Her being in the federal parliament is much more across it than I am. But I did just want to pick out a few things that Zali said. There's, I think, a real parallel between state and federal parliaments there, where she mentioned we've got quite a progressive climate minister in Chris Bowen who's trying to do good work, but he's in a cabinet of, the old guard of, Prime Minister and frontbenchers who are more captured by the coal and gas industries. And similarly, here in New South Wales, we have quite a progressive minister who is quite senior in the party, wants to do good things, and has certainly, staked her political capital on getting some quite ambitious things over the line, e.g. the Great Cobar National Park, but is really held back by more conservative colleagues. And one example of that sort of step backwards, if you like, is recent planning reform here in New South Wales, which really devastatingly, in the name of making building more housing stock and more available housing, just wiped out a bunch of environmental considerations and community consultation consideration from the planning system. So we're really disappointed to see that. But on the more optimistic note, Zali mentioned that one of the things that came out of the EPBC deal with the Greens was that, this fast tracking or this national interest rule couldn't apply to fossil fuel projects. And I think, you just think back to this time last year, there was a real possibility that we were going to have a coalition government who had an agenda for nuclear energy. And the fact that we now have this conversation at a national level around fossil fuel projects somehow being, requiring this extra level of protection that other developments don't require, I think is quite a shift in the Overton window. And, for so long we've been told by successive state and federal governments that, we're a country that is built on fossil fuel production, we need it in every way. And I think, this being part of the EPBC deal is a really just great signal of shifting understanding around fossil fuels as actually being something that are bad for our country. And Zali mentioned the closed loopholes around land clearing and logging, which are really significant, in particular the removal of that regional forestry agreement exemption. So for the last 20 years, logging our state forests here in New South Wales was able to happen without any kind of federal environmental protection or consideration in place. So we're talking about listed threatened species, greater gliders, koalas, their habitat being logged without any of that federal environmental consideration. So it's not going to come into place for 18 months, but I think that is a really important consideration. Oh yes, I just put this slide in because I love it. So this is a bit of a deviation, but we run a program of installing and monitoring nest boxes for large forest owls, and this is some footage from our nest boxes, and there's a bat there and some squirrel gliders and a goanna which have taken up home in our nest boxes, which in turn provide feed for the large forests, the powerful owls, and those this is all post bushfire on the north coast of New South Wales, sort of reinstalling habitat there. So anyway, that's a cute and cuddly little divergence for you there. But yeah, sorry, I did just want to mention on the Great Coala National Park. So the bigger picture for the states here in New South Wales, with the removal of that RFA exemption under the federal law, the Great Coala National Park on the north coast, suddenly our state forests all across New South Wales are under a lot more pressure to produce timber in a way that is economically viable. So taking up that 176,000 hectares on the north coast means, the north coast timber industry is suddenly much more expensive and harder to operate. They're also now going to have to consider matters of national environmental significance, and whatever the environmental standards are that fall out of that are now going to apply to these forests. And at the same time, there is a state-based process going on, the Forest Future of the Industry Action Plan, where the New South Wales government is currently reviewing the viability of the forestry industry in the state into the future. So I think what we actually have here is a confluence of conditions all coming in together at once. And so when that RFA exemption is removed from the federal legislation is in 18 months, as Zali said, that's also around the time of the next state election here in New South Wales. So it's going to be harder and harder for this government to, hand on heart, say that the native timber industry is good for New South Wales. So we'll be keeping a very close eye on that over the next year, and really, bringing together these different opportunities to really see the end of native forest logging in New South Wales. And because this is a Professionals for Climate group, I just thought I'd mention a few more just points on climate from this year. So gas decarbonisation, something that the New South Wales government again committed to before the last election. They've got a plan for getting the state off gas, but it only applies to households and small businesses. So we've been doing a bit of work looking at sort of small to medium industries like bigger factories, dairy producers, food producers, and so on, who use a lot of gas. And we've commissioned a consultant to pull together a report with a number of recommendations to go to the state government on how they can decarbonise those industries and get them off gas. We've developed a nature and renewables toolkit. So one question that I have in the back of my mind for Zali next time I see her is just how much the EPBC reform will allow the rollout of renewable energy here in New South Wales to happen at a pace, because at the moment it's not really happening quickly enough, and there are a number of roadblocks around the renewable energy rollout, not least of which is social license. And that's the awful conflicts that play out in communities where people don't like looking at their neighbours' wind turbines, but it's also people who have legitimate concerns about the impacts of large-scale renewable projects and associated infrastructure on nature. And as a nature group who is concerned about the impacts of climate change, we're really trying to be a genuine seat at the table with the New South Wales government around how they can mitigate impacts on nature so that we can get the renewables happening at the pace that's required, without losing that social license. And two really big wins that NCC, not directly claiming credit for, but certainly a really exciting outcome for climate and energy in New South Wales was the Mount Pleasant coal mine decision in the Land and Environment Court, and then again, similar decision on the Ulan modification, where the Land and Environment Court found that those modifications or extensions to those coal mines couldn't go ahead because they had not properly considered the local impacts of climate change in their applications. So, that sets an amazing standard, and it's actually being appealed, I think, in the High Court, or it's going like really far up the line. Because those coal miners are really scared that the fact that the system is waking up to the fact that if you dig coal out of the ground here and ship it overseas and burn it there, we still have to live with the impacts of climate change here. So I think that's a really amazing step forward. And just I've already mentioned the Red Bank outcome, but this is just a screenshot of the decision from the Independent Planning Commission, which shows that they refused the application based on its fuel load, which I think is just really significant because they're saying climate biodiversity impacts are not acceptable, which is really wonderful news. So I'll just leave it there and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That's really great to see how many fantastic things have happened for nature and the environment in the last year. Josie's asked, how do you navigate the strategic tensions between state and federal government for issues that cross jurisdictions, and what are the trade-offs?
Yeah, great question. And it's one where we work quite closely with our national organisation partners. So groups like Greenpeace, ACF, WWF, Environmental Defenders Office, were really quite central to the negotiations around the EPBC reform being, national groups and national reform. And so we sort of engaged in those processes through those partner organisations, and our carve-out is very much state government. But, there are a lot of those cross-jurisdictional issues, and one of our main concerns around the EPBC reforms is this devolution of power to the states, where business and industry are saying, oh, we don't want to double up on regulation, there's too much green tape. And so the federal government have said, well, we'll accredit the states and territories with the approval powers under the EPBC Act. And, as Zali mentioned, states like Western Australia, the Northern Territory have really terrible track records on regulating the environment. So how that plays out, we'll be definitely keeping a very close eye on that. And the other concern is around the offset scheme. So in New South Wales, we've had an offset scheme, a biodiversity offset scheme, for a long time, and the changes to the EPBC reform now incorporate a biodiversity offset scheme, which looks eerily similar to the state scheme here in New South Wales. So again, we'll be working quite closely with our partners at a national level around keeping an eye on that and pointing out where these changes are really bad for the environment and where they're really bad for biodiversity.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie, and well done on all the wins this year. It's been great to see. I know I just thought a very specific, be good to get your thoughts on what it was like being there. You were at the demonstration recently to stop coal ships entering Newcastle Port, and I know Pete Coughlin, who's also on the call, was there, I think, as well. It'd be great just to hear a bit about that and what it's like being in that kind of on a day like that.
Yeah, great question. And that was here in Newcastle. So I'm used to jumping on the train to Sydney to have to go to all the protests and things. So it was really nice to have something here on our doorstep. Honestly, it was just so much fun. It was so well organized. There were, people in their 80s and 90s, right down to little kids. It was logistically faultless. Like everything just made sense. It was easy to navigate. There were people, so many more volunteers than I've seen, handing out sunscreen, water, programs, pointing you in any which direction, workshops, guest speakers during the day. And then there was a main stage, live music, again, really engaging for people all across the spectrum. Really good fun and really safe. And being down on the beach, I'm not somebody who is interested in getting arrested in any way. But I definitely wanted to get in a kayak and go out and have a paddle, which I did. And it was really clear, where you could go and paddle safely without getting arrested. There was a high degree of coordination around people who were open to getting arrested. And people were really monitoring quite closely the shipping timetable. So we knew when there were ships coming and going, and they were able to deploy hundreds of people in a very short period of time to block the channel so that a coal ship couldn't get in. And it was just, I cannot fault the level of organization and coordination and just atmosphere. It was just lovely. It was just so nice walking around, bumping into people that you know and having a good time. It was just good fun. Yeah.
Yeah,
And if
that's
people
great.
have never been before, I can't really recommend it highly enough. I'm sure that it'll be back every year. I hope it'll be back every year. And, even the Lord Mayor of Newcastle, I saw a post on Facebook from him, just putting his support behind it, saying,
Mm.
it's you trust the science. He's a medical doctor. He trusts this, saying he trusts the science of medicine and he trusts the science of climate change. And, people are welcome to demonstrate and share their views in that way. So it was really, really
Yeah,
lovely.
it's interesting. John, who's on this call, has just made a comment there as well. He was there too, so it's great. Looking ahead to 2026, Jackie, key aims and goals for the NCC.
Yes. So next year, I think, is going to be huge, particularly the first 6 months of next year. The state election is March 2027. So we know that the government will go into campaign mode from about June, July next year. Similar to federal politics, the Liberal Party, the Liberal National Coalition here in New South Wales are a bit probably not in their best form. So, I think there will be, and for the most part, we know that governments do get re-elected in their second term. So, um, we've already seen some polling. We've started our analysis in the lead up to the election. Labor are likely to get re-elected. But I think that creates a number of opportunities for us. And I think the first 6 months of next year, the window is well and truly open for getting some things done in New South Wales. And for us, that will largely be land clearing. So that's one commitment that the government made before the last election that they have not delivered on. And I think, they've shaped the process so far. There's been some internal consultations. We've been invited to roundtables. We've been invited to provide comments on discussion papers and these kinds of things. But we're really trying to push the level of ambition within the New South Wales government, back to what we had with the Native Vegetation Act that Bob Carr brought in back in 2003, where it is right that the government should regulate what farmers and landholders can do on their land. And we've built this culture over time that has eroded that to this sense that, the government shouldn't be able to tell people what they can and can't do on their land. But for a lot of us who live in urban areas, if you want to cut down a tree, you have to go through planning processes and so on with your local government. And we don't think it's right that people who run agricultural or large development projects in regional or rural parts of the state don't have to go through those processes, especially where they have high biodiversity value vegetation on their land. So that'll be a really big one that we're looking at next year, is getting some outcomes on land clearing. I think also on coal and gas, I'm really keen to keep the work on industrial gas decarbonisation going and getting the New South Wales government to extend their roadmap beyond just residential and small business to those sort of medium-sized industries. And coal exports, I'm not quite sure what that's going to look like yet, but I think those wins that we've had in the Land and Environment Court with the local climate impacts, that sort of shift at the EPBC level around coal and gas projects not being able to just get rammed through. I think there's something there, whether it's the strategic statement on coal or, shaping up regulations of some description. But I think the first 6 months of next year, New South Wales Parliament, is going to be, big time for the environment.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I just want to make mention, Annie said she was there in Newcastle in the chat and that she was arrested. So Annie, thank you for doing that. You are a staunch and strong supporter for the environment in so many ways. You've done so much over the years. So thank you for your most recent action. Jackie, that's so exciting for next year. I know I'm not impartial. I'm conflicted with this, but I'm so excited about all you've done and also so excited for the year ahead and what can be done. And definitely hopeful and share your hope. And I know how busy you are, so thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah,
So
thanks.
great.
Fantastic.
Yeah, really fantastic.
I just wanted to mention, so no meeting in January. Everyone has a month off. And then in February, we've got February and March lined up already, and we're so excited about our first two speakers for the year. On February the 9th, our first meeting will have Leanne Sinclair, who's an academic at University of Sydney. And Leanne spoke at the regional conference for NCC during the year and is an expert in critical minerals. And Leanne just is so good at explaining what is a critical mineral. I mean, why do we call them critical? What are they actually used for? What do we need for the renewable transition, and what is actually being used for things like defence and all sorts of other uses that sort of gets put under the umbrella. So, and very fact-based. So that's going to be a terrific session. And then in March, our environment group session will be coincide with Climate Action Week on the 9th of March. And we've got Professor Ollie Jay from the University of Sydney, who's one of the co-authors of the Lancet report on heat and human health. And that report's for this year's just been released. So Ollie's going to present about that report, and we'll hopefully the group will be publicised through the Climate Action Week material and website. So we should have some good interest with that as well. So we've got a really good start to the year coming up. So thank you to everyone for joining us. I suppose, we really enjoy doing these sessions because we're doing it with you guys. So it's so fantastic to see so many wonderful friends and contacts and to meet so many more of you as well and be on the journey together. So wishing you a fantastic Christmas break and all the best, and we'll see you in 2026. And all the best.
Yeah, have a Merry Christmas. See everyone.
Bye, everyone.